So, Lord David Puttnam is a visionary in the intersection of education, media, and digital technology. With a celebrated career as a filmmaker, educator, and advocate for digital literacy, he has consistently championed the integration of technology to improve learning outcomes. As a former chair of the UK's Joint Committee on AI, Lord Puttnam brings unparalleled insights into the societal and ethical considerations of AI in education, making him a leading voice in shaping the future of learning. Wow, wonderful bio. And moving on to Richard Foster-Fletcher for all the newcomers in the call. Richard Foster-Fletcher, chair of MKAI.org, is a recognized expert in AI ethics, skills, and leadership. His work supports organizations in responsibly implementing AI to align with human values, ensuring sustainability and ethical integrity. In the education sector, Richard's focus is on empowering educators with the tools and strategies needed to prepare students for a complex and dynamic future. Thank you, and over to you, Richard.
Thank you so much. And David, would you top that up with any of your own words to share a bit about your background?
Only that if it weren't for my relationship, a long relationship going back a while with Rose Luckin, I would probably be here as a total fraud. But thanks to Rose, I think I can fight my corner.
Was Rose somebody who got you more interested in artificial intelligence?
When I was given the role of writing, particularly the education section of the House of Lords report on AI, on the potential of AI, future of AI, without Rose, I couldn't have done it, to be honest. And she was a pillar of strength and has remained that way. I still work with her.
I don't know her so well, but we have exchanged a few messages, and I certainly know her reputation. Indeed.
I'm being asked here, Richard, if I want to continue in Hindi. I don't think I do I?
It's up to you,
Am I the only one that's got this panel?
I think so.
I'll try and...
We get, oh, here we go. Confirm your speaking language. Good. It changes over the time, doesn't it? Well, I'll switch that from French to English. I thought I was speaking French, David. Must be my accent. So
I can't even find English on the panel. There's the truth. Oh,
you've got more scrolling.
God. Okay, I'm going to give up. Okay, thank you.
Great. Okay. So, let's talk about you. So you've had, in my own words anyway, an incredible career in both film and education. You've influenced me as a filmmaker particularly. But what would you say is the thing that connects these two worlds for you, film and education? What are the threads here?
Storytelling. In essence, it really is about storytelling. We are all, we need stories. Stories are really what, to an extraordinary degree, our own narratives and the narratives we latch onto are what drives our lives. And I think it's the capacity of storytelling to engage with education that interests me. I've got a kind of copper plea here. I was appallingly badly educated. I fled school at 16. I hated school. I really hated it. So part of my passion, I think, for education is motivated by revenge. I'm getting my own back on the educational service that served me so very, very, very badly when I was up to the age of 16. And I'm quite serious about that. It was because kids around the world were as badly educated as I was. We're in a lot of trouble as a society.
And what were the reasons for that?
Indifferent teaching. It was a difficult period, possibly. It was the 50s. A lot of the teachers that I managed to get my 11 plus. A lot of the teachers at my school didn't really want to be teachers. They come back from the war. There weren't a lot of jobs around, and they drifted. And it was their expression, not mine. They drifted into teaching. I don't think they had any particular interest in individual kids. Maybe if you looked as though you're going to get a state scholarship, they may suddenly surprise you with a degree of interest. But otherwise, it was just a question of getting us through school and out into the workplace. What was great for me was I loved the workplace, to my amazement. Just silly things. Worth mentioning, because someone laughed at this the other day. At school, I was always called Putnam. And the day I started work, I was called David. That seemed to me very civilized and something of a surprise, to be honest. And it was that. I just suddenly felt that I could become appreciated and actually could play a role and not just be a piece of machinery, just a body to move around from classroom to classroom every time a bell went off. I thought it was ridiculous. I actually found the entire process, with the exception of my history teacher, Miss Patrick, I found the entire process ludicrous. And I feel that today.
Yeah, I think I was at least 17 before somebody in an educational institution, my peers, I should say, held a door open for me. It took a long time for people to grow up. But you're in a good group of, you're in good company there, David, aren't you, of people where school didn't work out for them, but they've had incredible careers. Is it,
I think I am, Richard, but I said to there's a caveat to that. I emerged into, as it were, adulthood in the very early 60s, which was a period of extraordinary change and churn. Had it happened even 5 years earlier, it would have been a lot harder, lot harder. The truth
right?
was that by 64, 65, 66, people were interested in people who were interesting, if that makes sense. And I was a huge beneficiary of that.
And is it your creative streak, do you think, that made school so challenging? Or is it the teaching, you say, the apathy, the lack of enthusiasm? I mean, obviously a combination, but what is the role of creativity leading some of that frustration, do you think?
I mean, even the creativity, to the extent we were taught it, was kind of rather ridiculous. It was an art class that was the most uninspiring place in the world to go to. No, I think my dad was a photographer, and so I was brought up in a world of images. And he, for example, our daily newspaper wasn't it? It was always a good edition or a bad edition, and photographs were well used or not well used. So I was allowed into a critical thought area, at least in one compartment of my life. The other thing was my parents were remarkable. And this most important moment of my life, when I knew I was going to do very badly in GCSEs, walking to school with my dad, he was on his way to work, and I was trying to break the news to him. And he stopped. He said to me, David, I don't mind what you do. I don't mind if you want to be a coal miner. Just promise me you'll be one of the world's great coal miners. And that was the weight that lifted off my shoulders was it's incredible that actually but his expectations of me were not related to a set of exam results that were going to turn up next week, which were predictably terrible.
Yes. So he was conscious of the man
Yeah,
more than the achievement and becoming a whole person, perhaps.
yes. He knew I was a decent kid that I had interests, and those interests didn't have to coincide with the school's interests.
And just staying on this theme for a bit longer, what was it, a couple of years ago, our then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak talked about people doing sort of proper degrees, if you remember that moment. What was your reaction to that?
Well, I never thought he was the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I thought it was ludicrous and a total misunderstanding of either what really young people were interested in and also where the jobs of the future are likely to emerge from. I
Mm,
think the notion that to the degree that what Boris Johnson took was going to be of huge value to 90% of the people leaving schools was insane. But that's a view of my own. I mean, there are those obviously who entirely disagree. I do think that, for example, as a filmmaker, I wish I had had some grounding in the classics. I wish I'd had some grounding in philosophy, because in a sense, a lot of the decisions you make as a filmmaker are quite philosophical. You know, how are you going to address an audience? How are you going to frame this subject? Where you can take it? These are quite important issues because you're messing around in people's minds. But the idea that a quote classical education it really equips you to do that is a nonsense. But that's not just the point is no, but the creative industries that I emerge from is now I think the largest single area of employment in Britain. So the idea that these are not worthwhile, that entering that world does not contain, a worthwhile future and worthwhile qualifications is just stupid. I'm amazed he said it, and I'm pretty sure if he was on this call now, he would probably equivocate like mad.
yeah. I mean, for me, it was part of a set of statements that all seemed to be looking backwards, not forwards, not least of all wanting to draw up oil and gas from the North Sea and believing that that was going to help our GDP. So that sort of misalignment with 2024 um, and the skills that are needed. Because I think I see where you're leaning towards there is that AI is going to take a lot of heavy lifting, and those that can harness it in a creative way stand in very good stead. But those who are just going to be almost replicating or be a part of the machine by being institutionalized, by being um, you know, um, so fitting into standard boxes, I guess, that the future probably doesn't belong to them so much.
Well, we're already seeing it. I was at a conference last week. We're already seeing it in the film and television industries, where AI is taking quite a lot of the kind of the heavy lifting out of the industry. But the only areas it's taking the heavy lifting out are pretty well mechanistic. It is not going to, it's not going to create new narratives. It's not going to give you satisfying endings to stories that have never been told before. What it can do is it can give you slicker and cheaper special effects. It can allow things to get printed and disseminated and communicated more quickly. But as yet, it's not capable of an original thought.
Yes, my brother-in-law is in the music industry and works with some big names, and he says exactly the same thing. You won't see any of this creeping up in, in lyrics or songwriting, but in reverb and effects, absolutely, it's made a huge difference. But we have seen. So, what is it? Is it overreaction then? Do you think in Hollywood, David? The strikes from the writers?
I think the writers were quite right to take a cautionary approach. I really do. And I think it focused a lot of minds in quite an important way. The arrangement they've come out with is only a temporary one. I think it's 3 years before the whole thing has got to be rediscussed. But I just think it drew a line under what writers were expecting. Also, don't forget, I'm talking about, I think, high-end creativity. I wouldn't necessarily apply high-end creativity to a lot of, for example, daytime series television, where in fact you could start, I'm sure, making inroads into costs. And start replicating material. So I am talking about narratives that are original, because that's every creative person I've worked with, that's what they're aiming for, as well as trying to earn a living.
And as a filmmaker, how would you react to the way that people consume those sorts of series and movies now on their phone, multitasking, on much smaller screens?
Well, I have no problem at all with this because for a number of reasons. I teach all the time. For example, I think that the notion that image size is no longer a real factor, because in truth, if I take my iPhone here, put my iPhone about there, and if I've got a good pair of earphones in, the image I'm looking at is not that dissimilar than if I have the Odeon Leicester Square. It's because my peripheral vision hasn't altered. What does alter is other experiences. The shared experience of a comedy, for example, you obviously lose out there. But I try to encourage my students, look at the story you're trying to tell, look at the appropriateness of the medium you want to use. And a good way of looking at this is the following. I say to them, the big challenge for filmmakers, television makers, certainly filmmakers in the years to come, is the individualized versus the collective experience. That is to say, I do believe there's a huge future for glasses. They'll become simpler and become much more user-friendly, if you like. So it may well be that a lot of material, a lot of content can be delivered as an individualized experience, and indeed delivered maybe better. But then you've got the collective experience. So I think you've got to look at look at the narrative you're trying to address, look at what the audience you'd like to get to, and then in a sense, technologically, work your way through that. But this is not a binary situation. There will be lots and lots of material that will be designed for the individualized experience, and a lot of material, I hope that a lot of material, that will be designed for the collective experience. And this doesn't, for me, this isn't really being discussed enough. It's being discussed as a kind of either or. It's not an either or. It's a when and what's appropriate.
And are you comparing going to the cinema to watching a movie on a headset or a phone, or more is it the family around you on the sofa?
Oh, it's an interesting question, Richard. I went to a movie the other day and he went mad. People behind me were talking and the people next to me were crunching crisps throughout the thing. I actually wanted to shoot them. I'm better off here at home. I've got a very nice, as you can see behind me, a very nice large screen. I'm actually, it's a much quieter and in a sense more satisfying experience, except I'd say with a comedy where the ripple of laughter around you sets a mood, sets a frame. But no, I really got upset last week in a cinema. I couldn't believe the disrespect that was being shown to what was on the screen.
So you talked about the individualized versus the collective future of creating content. But what about people who are multitasking, people who aren't really paying full attention to what's on their phone? It becomes more like the radio then, doesn't it? They were sort of a background friend, perhaps.
It can do. I mean, I'm not a great podcast listener too, but most of my friends are. And the amount of information that they are gaining is extraordinary, and indeed extraordinary in extraordinary areas of subject areas. So I think people are plugging into quite interesting stuff. At the same time, there is a lot of, as you say, just background noise, a lot of background noise. I use my phone as a tool. When I look back, I hardly ever use the telephone now. My actual telephone. I make very, very few phone calls. 90% of my work's done on email, and partly because I like the idea it's all confirmed, and it gives me a greater sense of confidence. But I don't negotiate on a phone. I don't. Terrible thing to admit. I don't socialize on the phone either.
Yeah. Yes, I understand. I'm just thinking about the changes. If the consumption is more distractive, and passive, then I wonder about this narrative from the large technology companies who have a lot of ground in their sight. And one thing that will be a massive help to them in terms of the usability of output of AI systems is to have a more general acceptance of mediocrity.
I, I hear what you say. I wouldn't even know how to begin to answer. The notion of general acceptance of mediocrity is so frightening that
Yeah.
I want to run for cover. But we've just seen it in the United States election.
I wish he was mediocre.
There is a
That's
general.
aspirational.
Well, no, I think he is a deeply mediocre man, but who appeals to other mediocre people because they don't feel that that they're as mediocre as they probably are. No, I think that the success of Donald Trump is a spectacular example of the development of mediocre thought. In fact, it's the opposite of thought. It's a very, very good piece I read. Every day I get a newsletter from a marvelous woman called Heather Cox Richardson. She's an American historian. Um, and she's brilliant because she almost every day aligns what's happening with something that's happened in history. And what you get from her really is a sense that we're getting dumber and dumber and dumber. And that's quite frightening. Uh, and that people's acceptance of misinformation, people's almost, I want to go further than acceptance, the reassurance that misinformation sometimes offers people is terrifying. The best piece of work I ever did in Parliament was the very last piece. I did a report on trust, on the impact of disinformation, and I actually called it. It's awful. I've forgotten the title for a second. Anyway, I did it in June. It's available online. I did it in June 2020, and it's a bloody good. I would say it's a bloody good report. So June 2020. It's the best piece of work I ever did. And it sets out exactly the direction we're going in and the reasons for it and the role that social media companies are playing in it. We had 45 recommendations to the government. It was an all-party report. It was unanimous, and the government binned it, absolutely binned it, because it was extremely inconvenient. It required work from them. It required serious work on digital literacy, which I know you want to discuss. It required that we create a digitally literate society, but it also looked at the impact on elections. It looked at our election laws. It was a very, very good piece. 38,000 words is a bloody good report.
Yes. Yeah, I've seen several examples of that as well in the past, and it is incredibly frustrating. And even the money going in now from the UK government, and I know that we've got, joiners from all over the world here, it's pennies compared to what we need to invest.
Richard, it's worse than pennies. In 2004, we did a report on communication. The communications bill was brought forward, and I was very, very involved in it. In that bill, Ofcom were given responsibility for digital literacy in the UK. That was their job. It came with the job. If you wanted to run Ofcom, you had to take responsibility for a digitally literate society. They totally ducked it. They never did it. And here we are 20 years later, a digitally illiterate society, I would argue.
Very, very much. What would your advice be for somebody going into the world of filmmaking now with the changes ahead from AI?
I think it's very exciting. I mean, first of all, it's a lot easier to get a film made now than when I started. I mean, bear in mind, the biggest single, number one question when I started making a film was how much film can we afford? Because film was very expensive. 35 millimeter film was extremely expensive. And the amount of film you could actually put through a camera and then process and then print and then edit, that was a big, big fixed cost. Well, that cost it doesn't exist anymore. Plus, in those days, the equipment was in itself heavy, cumbersome. You needed 4 people on a camera. You needed 3 people on sound. So the size of your crew was also a limiting factor. So assembling all of that and assembling the resources to all of that was very, very intimidating. I got very lucky, really. Today, a really good filmmaker with a really strong idea, as Danny Boyle is at the moment, certainly, can make their entire film on that. Now, what will then happen to it? You can put it on YouTube. Quite a lot of people will recognize that you have talent, that you've got something to say, you've got a narrative that holds up, and you're off to the races. There's never been more short film festivals, for example, ever in the world. So getting your work seen, getting your work made is easier and cheaper. Getting your work seen is easier. Making that next shift up to what you regard as mainstream cinema, that's tougher. It is tougher, but that's a distribution problem, not a production problem.
But doesn't that flip around the strikes in Hollywood? And of course, we will talk about education today, David, as well. That, aren't they missing the point there? That actually they hold all the cards? They're the writers, they're the creative ones. Surely there's less reliance on everybody else in the supply chain now, isn't there?
I think in a sense that's true. And I think that writers have become conscious of that. You can see it just from the credits that more and more writers are now producers as well as writers. The downside of that, there is a real downside of that, but the individual voice of the filmmaker, the film people we used to regard as the filmmaker, that's the directors, but as well as the writers, is beginning to get lost. I mean, I look at quite a lot of Netflix stuff because it's in itself interesting, but increasingly the directorial component of it is beginning to look like painting by numbers. You don't see the individual style. So the emergence of I know people are concerned about Woody Allen, but the emergence of a Woody Allen, the emergence of a Pedro Almodovar is becoming less and less frequent. So that type of voice is getting drowned out. You're right, the author is doing well, but maybe he's never had more power. But not that many, I would argue, not that many authors have a voice that's really got something to say that we want to sit up and listen to. That's the problem.
Yeah. I think back to Pink Floyd and one of their songs, Shine On You, Crazy Diamond. I must have a 6.5 minute introduction, which somehow still feels about right in terms of timing. These days, you're lucky to get a 3-second introduction because of social media like TikTok, where it demands that you grab somebody's attention in the first few seconds. Otherwise, they're not going to stick around to hear it, or you only get 10 seconds of the song being blasted out, which does seem, again, a little bit like you were saying, the paint by numbers in directing. It does seem like a formula that you have to stick to in music. And that's, I guess, the power of the consumption. Is that what we're seeing in film as well? The way people are consuming, the attention spans, the devices.
I mean, there's no interesting paradox here, which is that I've been looking at a lot of movies recently because of showing a jury, but also with the Oscar offers coming up. One thing is clear to me is that filmmakers have forgotten how to do 3-act plays. They're increasingly 4- and 5-act plays, and they don't have to be. And I think there's an issue there where you can actually end up alienating audiences by having 2 hour 20, 2 hour 30, 2 hour 40 minutes of movies, but for stories that really ought to be 90-minute stories. So
Yes.
that's another whole debate.
And what sympathy would you have for Hollywood, given that they have been formulaic? They've churned out repeat after remake after repeat after remake.
Well, it's hard for me to get too critical because my generation was hugely reliant on the goodwill, let's say the goodwill of Hollywood. I'd often I used to get to conversations, particularly European film, about Hollywood, negative conversations, and I would always use the Life of Brian thing of, what have the Romans ever done for us? So we say, well, whatever Hollywood ever done for us? Well, it's actually financed half your movies. It's actually given you a platform. It's actually allowed your films to be distributed in the United States. It's not all bad news. So I rather resist the idea that there's a binary relationship between European filmmaking and Hollywood filmmaking. There's some brilliant filmmakers in Hollywood, some brilliant filmmakers in Europe. And the more they talk to each other and get to know each other, the better.
To him only shall be given. So you talked some time ago in our conversation about some of the frustrations you had with your own schooling. I share many of those frustrations. I don't think I succeeded very well at school. I scraped through with the grades I needed to get my bachelor's and then found myself in the working world and probably still then took 16 years to figure out who I was as a person and what I wanted to do. Fortunately, life gave me the time and the runway to do so. But how much do you think education has changed over those decades? Does it still feel like somebody at the front in Victorian style classrooms?
It's improved. I mean, the short answer really is not enough. Has it changed? No, not enough. I think one of the really interesting things, I suppose this is the meat of this discussion, that AI in particular, but the digital world in general offers, is the dream of, certainly the dream of my generation of educators, which was personalized learning. We now can definitely, with more, let me put it another way, we're moving towards an era in which we can identify the learning needs of individual students and teach them in a way that addresses those learning needs. We don't have to teach children any longer as 30 nodding heads in a class, all with the same inputs and the same outputs. So I think that the whole world of personalized learning, which was a dream for many of us in the particularly 80s, and probably earlier, although I wasn't around to share it. I think that is becoming realized and is likely to be increasingly realized.
We think about the expensive private schools, David, 45 odd thousand pounds a year. You expect
that's what's happening. Well,
yeah.
let me say, first of all, declare an interest. I work at Lord Anglia, which in a sense is one of those groups of schools. But what we're able to do, because of the arrangement I have and others of my colleagues have with them, is that anything we learn in this area does get disseminated much more widely. We invest massively, £25 million last year, in professional development. So I do think what we're doing is because we've got the resources to do it, is developing the teachers of the future, the pedagogy of the future, and the means of reducing the costs of all of that, which will inevitably happen. So we'll get there. It's just taking a long time.
Is that a bit like Formula One and the way that the innovations get passed on to mainstream cars?
You know what? I hadn't thought of it before. It's a very good analogy. It's a very, very good analogy.
And the benefit of being in one of those schools, and I don't think there should be any criticism in the sense of those schools using the very latest technologies and investing in them, because we need great leaders in our society. We need great people. We need great talent, of course, to lift all of society.
Richard, can I make a point?
Of course, David.
Very important. I don't think it's fully understood. We also need mobility, and what the schools that certainly I work with offer is mobility. So our clients, if you like, are not individual parents for the most part. They are Google, they are JP Morgan, they are Amazon, they're the multinationals who need or feel the need to move talent around the world. And part and parcel of the package, as you like, is that you move with your family and therefore with your kids. So what is interesting is that what we're finding, we're 90 schools, I think, we're finding that we're actually educating the next generation of tech children. It's quite interesting. These are not like, well, in a sense, it's a little bit like Richie. These are not traditional old Etonians following their dad and their grandfather and great-grandfather into school. It's quite different. I would be surprised if 90% of our parents, I would guarantee, did not go to private schools. Which is quite interesting. Now I'm saying maybe 80%, but it's a very, very high percentage. That would not be true of the classic English public school system.
Yes. In that situation, I'm intrigued. Do you think the change management of getting teachers to adopt new technologies like AI is just as difficult as in some state schools?
The answer is yes and no. Here's an absolutely remarkable figure, because it came in last week. What do you think the applicants to, particularly Lord Anglia schools, how many applicants do you think we have for each teaching job?
100?
Oh, gosh, you got the other end. 60. We have 60 applications for every job. And we have around 1,000 jobs a year. So we work out the numbers. But my point is, why do they apply? Because I think what's happened is that our professional development programs have become not just successful, very popular. other teachers talk about them. And so it's actually the aim of the teachers applying is to get onto our professional development programs. 80% of our staff right across the school have been promoted from within the organization. 80% of our principals come from within the organization. So there's something going on which is of genuine, serious interest. Some people might find it socially, offensive even, but I think my own view is it's better to have been on the inside, as it were, pissing out than the outside pissing in. I am the victim of 20 years spent working in public education, smashing my head against a brick wall. I feel that very strongly. I feel I achieved so little during the years at the DFE and then working with the government that my present role, it feels abundantly useful.
Yes, I know that feeling. How much more personalized do you think the education is in Nord Anglia than if we picture it?
Massively. First of all, just class sizes. Our average class size is 15, 12 to 15. So you start there, but and that's a big help. But in terms of actually now, we've been, in the last few years, been spending a lot of time, effort, and energy on the whole area of metacognition, teaching children to learn, getting kids to understand how they learn, what their own learning processes are. And you start there. So the whole area of metacognition, I think, is only really at baby steps at the moment. But once you understand what your own learning process is and learning how you learn, you're a long way, you've advanced a long way as a learner. Now, frankly, that's relatively new. I mean, I would say that probably a lot of people involved in pedagogy would argue that we've been on the fringes of that for a long time. But we have absolutely mainstreamed it. We're back to Rose Luckin and her team who I've been working with. We've absolutely mainstreamed this throughout the entire group of schools, with more success in some countries than others, in fairness.
Yes. So what were you describing before then in terms of AI and personalized learning in more mainstream schools? What does that look like for you?
Well, it's simply the ability to chop things up and offer them in and recategorize them in terms of what the potential of that child is and what that child's interests are. I mean, the most important thing I think, which we're learning, is you start off with the individual child. What are their interests? What is their learning pattern? Because children vary enormously in their learning pattern, and then applying the curriculum and applying their day-to-day learning to exactly that. And it does mean that it's extra work for teachers. It's not all that easy. But we've found that once they get into that, it's so rewarding knowing that every single kid is progressing either at their own pace or within their own area of interest. It almost becomes second nature. We're halfway through a journey, Richard. I don't want to pretend that I think we're not the finished product yet at all, but we're halfway along a journey where I'd say that most of education is only 10% along the way.
Well, when you think about how few people in the working world can connect their talent to their income, to the things that they care about in the world, there's not many of us.
No, I've never been to work. I should make that point. Really, I have spent my entire life doing things I've enjoyed. And every time I've stopped enjoying it, I've stopped doing it. I retired from the film industry when I was 56. I wasn't really enjoying it anymore. And I was very lucky to be after the House of Lords. So every time in my life, I left advertising when I was 26, same thing. When I felt that I was beginning to hit the buffers or not enjoying it or not enjoying the people I was working with, I've moved. So that's an incredible privilege. And I understand that.
Is that one of the things that kept you so energized, do you think, David?
Yeah, the other thing is I made a decision as soon as I possibly could, only to ever work with people I liked. The idea of going to work with people I disliked is to me, that's torture. Or people I'm suspicious of, or people who I feel don't that in the same way that I have what's good for them in mind, don't have the same thing for me. I think that is literally living torture, working with people you don't like.
Hell is other people. Jaisal, perhaps you could just check in on the chat and the room for a few moments, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. We have some questions in the chat and a few comments. So I should go on to the questions first, I think, because people want to hear from David. Um, So one of the questions that we have from, I think we have multiple questions from Mila. So I'll try to put one by one. So do you think the recent movements by US courts to hold big tech accountable relatively like Google and Facebook trials are movements in a positive direction for regulation?
Entirely. And I'm afraid that they're all going to come to a grinding halt on the, what is it, the 20th of January. Because they've been driven by a woman I've got a lot of admiration for, Lena Khan, who's the Federal Trade Commissioner. And I think that she will be opposed or deposed without doubt on day one of the Trump administration. But they are all moves in the right direction, as indeed were the moves being made in Europe. I think in many senses, Europe's been ahead of the US in terms of regulation and legislation. But again, we're going to lose the prime mover in that. Margareta Vestager is also retiring. So two important women are going to be bowing out of an area that I think is hugely important.
Thanks so much, David. I have one more question from, I'll go on to asking first Kevin's question and again Mila's questions. So Kevin has asked, I'm collaborating with Right Angle Education, a Singaporean initiative to bring their KI practical use program to Switzerland. We'll be teaching kids aged 8 to 23 how to apply AI in real world scenarios, both in person and virtually. What aspects of AI do you think are most important for young people to learn about in today's world?
Well, two things. Number one, I just got back, but before I was in Seville, I was in Singapore. I teach in Singapore and I go to Singapore regularly. And I think that the attitude of the government to Singapore and the attitude of educators in Singapore to AI is very, very healthy. It's the healthiest AI environment that I've encountered. Now, the answer to the other part of the question is trickier. I would suggest that young people have got to understand that AI can offer them a flood of information. So the really important thing we need now to teach young people is to both make judgments about the quality of information, but more important than that, to actually use quality information to advance whatever it is they're doing. Don't forget, a huge amount of all of our lives, including mine, incidentally, have been spent literally gathering information, just doing a lot of the heavy lifting. You were doing it when I was doing a movie, a huge amount of the work was just kind of bringing things together. The actual decision-making bit was relatively small. I think what will happen is we'll get rid of a lot of the heavy lifting, and it'll be much more to do with the quality of your decision-making. What do you do with the information you've now got? How do you use it? Do you use it constructively, destructively? How do you use it? Now that in itself, I'm going slightly outside of my sphere of knowledge here, but I would argue that in itself is a form of pedagogy. Teaching young people how to make decisions with the information they've managed to gather is a very different thing than just teaching young people how to gather information. I've never said that before. That may come. I'm looking at Mick Flood when I say this, Mike. That may come out sounding ridiculous, but I've got a feeling that there's a germ of truth in there. That it's a different pedagogy. Decision making is somewhat different from information gathering.
Absolutely, I think, and teaching decision making is really a skill set which all the young people need. There are a couple of more questions. So Mila has asked another question. How do you balance personalized learning with the ability to move beyond your discipline, cross-pollinate across disciplines, or push yourself a bit further beyond your abilities, that is zone of proximal development or develop resilience?
Well, I would say it's to do with an inquiring mind. I mean, in my experience, and this is just talking about me for a moment, I find that once I latch onto something I find interesting, it has a natural roots into movement. Now, for example, the thing I'm focusing on at the moment, I wanted to say this because one of you may be able to help me, is I didn't know about eudaimonics chemicals until very recently in the brain. What I knew was I knew a lot about dopamine. And when I didn't understand that these are two chemicals that kind of relate to each other, and that dopamine is a hit with a relatively short-term benefit, but it can be the hook of a song. It can be the title of it can be a title of a movie, but it isn't long-term thought. It isn't consideration. It doesn't allow you to reflect. Whereas eudaimonia thinking or eudaimonia chemicals are the opposite. They are much longer term and they allow for reflection. And I'm very interested now in how, as a communicator, as someone who deals in narratives and storytelling, how do you manage to combine the importance of the dopamine hit, i.e. attracting attention, with then the eudaimonia hit of retaining attention and creating reflection. So this is where my thinking is going at the moment. Now, that's brand new to me. And so I'm trying to answer your question as best I can. But I think it's about an inquiring mind, developing an inquiring mind. Because if you've got an inquiring mind, the question you ask, in a sense, is answered.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think we have a stream of questions today, and I'll move on to the next one. Fritz has asked you, David, would you have wanted to use AI when you started your film career?
I would have loved to have been released from I referred to it. I'd love to have been released from the burden of physical film. I certainly carry a piece of film with me wherever I go, always to explain to my students, you've got to understand that my entire career was spent looking through bits of celluloid, which barely exists anymore. AI could have been extremely useful, but it's interesting. My daughter works in the film industry. What she says to me is, yes, they've got fantastic programs now for accounting and regulating things. But the truth is, she would argue, and I would certainly argue, that we were almost quicker and better when we did it with bits and paper and our intuition and our instincts. I used to work alongside a guy who was my production accountant. If I said to him, look, if we do this, and this, how will that affect the budget? He would literally get a pencil out and within 15 minutes would tell me. He would tell me. If I feed that into a computer today, I'll get a stream of paper out. I'm not sure it'll give me an answer. Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense to me. We do this every day. So yeah, I still love the pen and paper and not the Confluence whiteboard or other whiteboards that we have been using. It saves time, but yeah, it's still some people want to go back to pen and paper. So the next question is, Angelo has asked, hi, David, you acted as a chancellor of 2 major universities. What was the sentiment at that time about using AI in education?
It didn't exist. I mean, I think when I left the OU in 2015, remember, 15 or 16. It basically was not even. It wasn't even a gleam in many people's eyes. You probably had to. Probably, if I'd been a scientist, I would have understood what was coming down the pike, but I didn't. I mean, I loved my time as a chancellor. There were very different experiences. Sunderland was very hands-on. It was a brand new university. I was its first chancellor, and we were building something. We were almost trying to build a brand from nothing. Whereas at the OU, I inherited a very good brand. I missed there not being. I missed the student interaction. On the other hand, I've never had better experiences than the OU graduation ceremonies. So there was a trade-off there. I missed the day-to-day of being on a campus with students, but I used to love the. I don't know, Mike will tell you. I tried to turn the graduation ceremonies into events, and I think we did a pretty good job of doing it in the end. Because the satisfaction of dealing with people who've taken 5, 6, 7, 8 years to reach that platform is immense, and it's transformative. I used to watch people crossing the stage, and I would weep. Honestly, some of the time, absolutely incredible. Every one of them had a story, and every one of their stories was awesome. So yeah, it was a great experience.
Thanks. I hope it answers for Angelo. And I'll move on to the next question. Atef has asked, what advice can you give me regarding utilizing short clips, nearly 1 or 2 minutes, from movies in teaching students global issues?
I do it all the time. I restrict myself to 3 minutes because I don't want to offend against copyright. On the other hand, other than that, I ignore copyright. There's the truth. Because I think that I've always believed there should be an educational exception to copyright. And so I use 3-minute clips, but I use them all the time. I use them to illustrate points. I use them to ram home points. I use slides. I've got 5,000 clips. I've been teaching for 12 here online. I've been teaching for 12 years, 13 years this year. And I've got 5,000 clips. And I can only prove it by showing them to you, but every one of them is there for a purpose. Every one of them is there to make a point and sometimes to reinforce a point. So I'm a total believer. And I wish there was a very clearly defined education exception for the use of clips and audiovisual material. It's a messy area. I deal with it by ignoring it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, David. And I think this gives me an idea as well how to utilize clips at home and in my art classes. I'm going to think about it offline. Laura has asked, how are your students when considering tacit knowledge, thinking about how this can be potentially transferred and put the human back into the AI?
I think all of my teaching, because of the subject areas I deal in, are all about being a human being, a better human being, a more informed human being. So I make sure that in every mix, in the mix of anything I'm doing, I always include quite a lot of documentary. I talked about how powerful documentary can be. One of the heroes of my life is a friend of mine called Ken Burns, who makes remarkable long form documentaries. I think Adam Curtis, a UK filmmaker, is an amazing, actually a philosopher, a genuine philosopher. But you've got to be prepared to watch 8 and 9, 10 hours of his films if you want to agree with me. So I think that my stuff is my work is all about making better human beings more aware of their surroundings, more aware of their responsibilities. I put a very heavy burden on my students. Basically, I say to them, look, your career is going to be messing around in people's heads. You owe every single one of the people you make films for the obligation of knowing what you're doing, knowing why you're doing it, knowing what vision of the world do you have that's going to be enhanced by the film you make. And if it isn't, are you just earning a living?
Absolutely. I think this
I'm
is
really quite
marvelous.
tough on them. I'm quite tough on them.
Absolutely. I think films influence people in various ways in their normal lives, I think, and that needs to be up to the mark because people try to mimic that as well sometimes. And globally, we are seeing this already due to social media. Aisha has asked, thank you for your insightful session. I wanted to ask how AI tools can help students enhance their collaborative critical thinking, problem solving, leadership, and adaptability skills.
Oh, that's a nice, simple one. I think if any attempt of mine to answer that properly would just, I'm afraid, would throw a very strong light on my ignorance. I'm not sure, but I am a positive thinker. I do believe that we will end up using AI intelligently. It doesn't mean that AI will treat us well, but I think that we will find ways of using AI intelligently, certainly within the education sphere. It carries enormous dangers with it. I mean, one of the things that, one of the reasons I so admire Rose is that the really important book she wrote was all about the dangers that AI carried with it, particularly for young people. But how that's going to pan out, I'm 83 now. I probably won't be around to find out. There's the truth. And as I've got a limited amount of brain time, I'm not sure how much time I'm giving to try to work those things through. I work with really brilliant directors of education across the whole group at Nord Anglia. And I would make a point of asking them the next time I get together with them. I apologize. That's a question that's really somewhat beyond my pay grade.
Thanks, David. There are two more questions and some comments. So there's another question from Mila. Do you think that digital literacy education should be mandatory for K-12 audiences? Which countries do you believe are doing this well at scale already?
The answer to the second bit is no. The first bit is I would argue that K-12 is too late. I think that you should become digitally literate at the age of 8. And I mean that with absolute sincerity. I think that to leave it until 12 was very risky. I would like to think that every 8-year-old ought to be able to regard themselves as digitally literate. because I think the dangers of AI begin to cut in very seriously at around 11 and 12. Whereas I think that the 8-year-old mind, the 7-year-old, the 8-year-old, 9-year-old mind is more attuned to what's right and wrong. That's a huge statement, I think, isn't it? But I think there's some truth in that. I think that kids before puberty certainly have a better sense of right and wrong than the post justifications that emerge that arise during and after puberty. So I would eight would be my, if I was king of the world, I'd say I want every child in the world to be digital literate by the age of 8, at the age of 8.
Thanks, David. I think my son is 8, so I am already looking at his digital literacy. I did mention in a couple of sessions earlier. There's another question from John. Do you think that AI has enhanced or diminished recent epic movies such as Ridley's Gladiator sequel?
Apparently not. I read the review in the Guardian this week and a couple of other reviews, New York Times, and they feel that the film is better than Gladiator 1 because the more extreme sequences are better rendered and more realistic. So I haven't seen the film yet. I mean, Ridley's a very close friend of mine. I produced his first film. I'm hoping it'll work. He was very, very nervous before it opened because Napoleon was such a lack of success, let's put it that way. So I hope it does work. But it's very interesting. These 2 reviews by people I do respect, New York Times and The Guardian, both felt that the film was enhanced rather than diminished.
Thank you so much, David. There are some comments. I'll just quickly go through and then over to you, Richard. So Alex has written, the temptation to copy an established formula is also filling the space, which was previously available for new ideas or voices, 11 series, 12 series of TV, or 9 or 12 movies in a franchisee. Do you have any comments to add on it, David?
Yeah, I think that in the commercial end of the equation, it's true. But I would argue that the opportunity for people with really, really strong ideas and a strong narrative sense to make a short film, a 20-minute film, a 15-minute film, get it online, get it on YouTube, get it recognized. What you've got to remember, that it's just a talent business. The studios are constantly searching for talent. I interviewed on stage last week Kathleen Kennedy, who's the head of Lucasfilms and Disney and Lucasfilms. She was saying exactly the same thing. They are screaming for talent. They can't wait to find original talent. I watched a wonderful film this week, Emilia Perez. I don't know if any of you have seen Emilia Perez. It's a wonderful piece of work by a very unique talent, Jacques Audiard, a Frenchman. So the opportunity for talented people has never been greater to be spotted and were nurtured. We're going through a weird period at the moment where I think the industry is trying to adjust to the extraordinary success of the streamers. The streamers are trying to adjust to how much volume they need to put out, what that volume needs to consist of, how much sport, how much entertainment, how much comedy. So I think it's a kind of mixing bowl at the moment where you could feel that there's ingredients being thrown into that mixing bowl. But the ingredient that's really important, and the ingredient that's been missing, is unique and special talent with a view of the world that's going to sustain. I just want to make one point. I live in Ireland, which is a wonderful country for storytellers. Wonderful, wonderful country. When you analyze it, all the stories that are sustained throughout history have, in a sense, had a point to them. They haven't been copies. You could say they're copies of other stories. You could easily say they're copies of other stories, but they've got a point to them. And the point of them is to try and help us as human beings through the veil of tears that life can easily be. That's their purpose. And why would that have changed? There is no reason that during the course of human development that won't be the driving force or the driver of new and better narratives. That's what stories always have been. I think that's what stories always will be.
Thanks, David. I think there's one new question that has just come up in the chat, and then I'll pass on to you, Richard. Thomas Witt has asked, how can we reach people in areas or regions with only cell phones but no access to digital learning in schools?
You can. I mean, I was amazed the other day looking at the statistics from India, where basically most films are consumed on cell phones. Most movies are consumed on cell phones. And that's in a big movie-going region of the world. So clearly, an entire generation has adjusted to getting their narratives through that. In a sense, you can't argue with it. The history of cinema is only 120 years old. It started as flickering images on people's, on a kind of sheet that had been pulled out, and it was silent. We are in an evolving communication environment, a constantly evolving information environment. And I could argue, I won't, but I could, that basically the changes made to the way in which stories were told between 1890, between the first Lumiere films and the coming of sound, the changes that took place were more dramatic than anything we're encountering today. People suddenly had access to stories in a completely new way. And because they were silent, it meant there was no language barrier. People were absorbed into other people's stories, other people. For me, there were two absolute geniuses in the world that I've inhabited, only two. Charlie Chaplin, Walt Disney. Every single thing in the audiovisual world, its roots, the parents of it, are there. And what I try and constantly say to my students, look at Chaplin. If you understand Chaplin, look at the way Chaplin deals with your emotions. Look at the way Chaplin deals with your responses. There's nothing really changed that much. Similarly, Disney. Slightly different medium or different use of the medium. But those two guys, they happen to be guys, I apologize for that. They had to be guys. Those two guys changed everything, the way we see. And these more recent developments, technological developments, are only building off the back of that.
Thanks, David, and over to you, Richard.
Yeah, thanks for all those questions. I know there were a few more as well, if we could have got to everything. And I recall that they were big fans of Mr. Bean in Japan, David, for exactly the reasons that you were describing. And I must mention our friends in Ireland. I used to be a prominent member of Toastmasters, and at the competition stages, if you got far enough, you would then compete with the clubs in Ireland. And I felt that was extremely unfair. And I would never win. So we've just unfortunately run the clock down. So I'll ask you this last question that we've been asking our guests in this series is what would you like us to hold in our minds? Maybe what question would you like us to hold in our minds as we go about the rest of our week? What would you have us ponder on, David?
I would ponder on a question that's as kind of old as time, really. What is truth? What is truth? Because once you lose a grip of what is truth, or once you cease to believe in what is true, you're in no man's land.
David, thank you so much for spending an hour with us. It's been an absolute great pleasure for me, and I'm sure for others. I will just finish by wishing my mother, who's with us today, a very happy 70th birthday today. Still forever young. I hope we can stay in touch, David. I'm sure there'll be one or two things that we'd love to talk to you about in the future.
And I'd just say how nice it was to see. I haven't seen Mike for a long time. Mike, lovely to see you, catch you in the corner. And I hope things are going well for you there.
I'm glad we're amongst friends.
God bless.
All right. Look after yourselves, everybody. Thanks
Bye.
again, David.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.